You know, if you're like most people, you probably grew up believing a very specific, highly dramatic story about the Library of Alexandria. The idea is that the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world was suddenly, tragically burned to the ground in a single, catastrophic fire. It just wiped out thousands of years of human wisdom overnight. It's an incredibly compelling image, right? Just this blazing inferno erasing the ancient world's hard drive. But as we're going to see in this explainer, the real story of why the library actually declined is a whole lot stranger.
Okay, let's dive into this. The myth that's completely permeated pop culture is one of a giant, cinematic fire. But the reality? The library actually fell victim to centuries of slow neglect. The truth of how this monumental institution really died is actually much sadder and, honestly, much more relatable to how institutions fail today. It wasn't some overnight disaster. It was a painfully slow demise. But to really grasp how it fell apart, we first have to understand the massive stakes of what was actually lost.
So, the Library of Alexandria was founded in Egypt in the early 3rd century BCE under the Ptolemaic dynasty, and their goal was nothing short of breathtaking. They didn't just want a really good regional library. No, they had this incredibly audacious goal to collect a copy of quite literally every single book in the known world. I mean, imagine the sheer ambition required to look out at the entirety of human knowledge and say, yep, we want all of it right here in one building. But obviously, you don't achieve a goal like that just by politely asking people for donations.
To build this collection, they used these incredibly aggressive, almost pirate-like methods. Whenever a ship docked in Alexandria's harbor, it was immediately searched. But they weren't just looking for contraband or taxable goods, they were hunting for scrolls. When they found them, they confiscated the originals, brought them to the library, copied them down, and then, here's the real kicker, they often kept the precious originals and just handed the freshly made copies back to the owners. They essentially leveraged their position as a massive trade hub to systematically siphon knowledge from every single traveler passing through.
And through those absolutely ruthless acquisition methods, the collection just ballooned. At its absolute height, estimates suggest they gathered an astonishing 400,000 scrolls. Now, to be totally fair, because so little precise record-keeping survives from that era, historical estimates range anywhere from 40,000 on the low end to 400,000 on the high end. But even if you look at the most conservative estimates, the sheer volume is just staggering. We're talking scrolls covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, literature, pulling in traditions from the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Persians, and way beyond. It was literally the ultimate brain trust of antiquity.
And this brilliantly illustrates that this massive concentration of data didn't just create a dusty warehouse. It created an active, buzzing research center filled with some seriously heavy-hitting geniuses. You had Euclid walking the halls, literally laying down the foundational rules of geometry. You had Eratosthenes, who somehow managed to calculate the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, using nothing but shadows, geometry, and a brilliant mind. And even Archimedes, one of the greatest mathematicians and inventors of all time, is believed to have visited and actively corresponded with the scholars based there. The intellectual energy in this place must have been absolutely electric.
But, unfortunately, this golden age didn't last. The decline of the Library of Alexandria wasn't a single point of failure. It was a multi-century bleed. It was a series of compounding paper cuts across different eras and under different rulers, rather than one big Hollywood explosion. Spanning from 48 BCE all the way down to 391 CE, we are really looking at a chronological autopsy here. So let's walk through exactly what happened at each of these critical junctures.
The first major date in this timeline of decline is 48 BCE. And this is actually the origin of the famous fire myth. During Julius Caesar's civil war, a fire was set in Alexandria, and popular legend says this is when the Great Library burned down. But modern historical analysis tells a very different story. That fire likely only destroyed warehouses of scrolls situated near the city's docks. These were probably books awaiting export or shipment, not the main library collection itself. So while it was definitely a terrible loss of texts, it absolutely was not the fatal blow to the institution that many people think it was.
The crucial turning point is actually what happened a couple of decades later, in 30 BCE. This is when Egypt officially became a Roman province. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had so fiercely championed and funded the library, weakened and entirely lost its power. And with that loss of power came a deeply relatable modern problem: budget cuts. As the royal funding dried up, the prestige of the library faded. Without a wealthy, dedicated monarchy aggressively funding the search for new scrolls and paying top-tier scholars to study them, the institution simply began to stagnate. It's just a classic case of an institution starving from a lack of steady financial support. Fast forward a few hundred years to the 270 CE, and we start to see the physical toll of endless political chaos. During this time, the Roman Emperor Aurelian launched a major military campaign to retake Alexandria from the breakaway Palmyran Empire. Now, this wasn't a targeted attack on knowledge. It was just brutal, messy urban warfare. The military campaign caused widespread destruction across parts of the city, and crucially, this included heavy damage to the royal quarter, which was the exact neighborhood where the Great Library was located. The structural integrity of the institution was literally crumbling under the weight of civil war.
This brings us to 391 CE, which was another highly destructive moment, but one born out of religious tension rather than just military conquest. By this time, the original main library was almost certainly a shadow of its former self, but an affiliated daughter library still existed, housed in the Serapeum temple. However, under a decree from Emperor Theodosius I ordering the closure of pagan temples, severe conflicts erupted between Christians and pagans in the city. And amidst this intense and violent religious clash, the Serapeum and the books housed within it were destroyed.
Now, what's really interesting about this next piece of the puzzle is a story from 642 CE when Arab forces took Alexandria. There's this incredibly vivid, widely circulated legend that a caliph captured the city and ordered all the remaining books of the Great Library to be used as fuel to heat the city's public baths for 6 whole months. I mean, it's a dramatic image, right? And it's a story that has been repeated for generations to explain the final, definitive death of the library. However, we really have to debunk this final myth. Most modern historians view this bathhouse story as a much later invention. It wasn't a documented contemporary event. It was actually first recorded centuries after it supposedly happened. The historical reality is that by the time of the Arab conquest in 642 CE, the Great Library of Alexandria, as an organized, functioning institution, had already ceased to exist centuries prior. There simply wasn't a massive, centralized collection left to burn.
Ultimately, the true autopsy of the Library of Alexandria reveals that it wasn't erased in a blaze of dramatic glory. Institutions usually fail slowly rather than all at once. It was centuries of slow neglect. It was fatal funding cuts when the political winds changed. It was endless political chaos, urban warfare, and shifting empires. Irreplaceable human knowledge was erased, sadly, just one scroll at a time. Texts rotted, they were misplaced, they were damaged in street riots, or they simply weren't copied before they decayed. And the most unsettling part of this entire story is that we don't even know exactly what was lost. We have no idea what scientific breakthroughs or literary masterpieces just quietly faded into dust.
Which brings us to a final, rather sobering thought to leave you with. We always look for the big dramatic events in history, you know? The fires, the invasions, the grand catastrophes. But the destruction of the ancient world's greatest brain trust happened quietly, through changing budgets and shifting priorities. So, if history's greatest library died from slow neglect and funding cuts, we have to ask ourselves, what knowledge are we quietly losing today? What vital information, scientific data, or cultural history is slowly decaying or being defunded right now, without us even noticing it's gone?